Before I do so, however, I'd like to make a quick observation based on something that was noticed by Jacob Dreisen and which you can find discussed in the latest edition of his Dreisen report. In my programs yesterday and the day before yesterday, I mentioned that I discussed a rather desperate video plea by the person who is now referred to as the commander of the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory, Sergei Volina. And I discussed how completely out of touch he appeared to be with battlefield realities when he was talking about an evacuation of the troops in the Azovstal factory in a manner akin to what happened in 1940 with the British military in Dunkirk. What I hadn't appreciated, and what Jacob Dreisen pointed out, is that this was a plea that Sergei Volina was making to the Ukrainian government, but which was made by Volina in Russian. In other words, the language he used was Russian, not Ukrainian. Now, I find that extremely strange. I'm sure Volina does speak Ukrainian, and I wonder why he chose to speak in Russian. I say that because I'm sure that, as I said, he could have made his comments in Ukrainian if he chose. And I have to say that I do wonder whether this wasn't a signal to the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev that Volina is in fact now considering a possible surrender. Now, that's just a guess. I'm not going to pursue the point any further. I just make the observation. I do find it all extremely strange. Anyway, the latest attempt to evacuate the civilians apparently follows from discussions that President Putin of Russia had with Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and the intention is to try to negotiate the withdrawal of these civilians from the Azovstal factory, with the negotiations being undertaken by the various United Nations agencies, the UN Secretariat, the International Committee for Refugees, those sort of things. We will see whether this succeeds. Up to now, there's been repeated attempts to persuade the troops in Azovstal and to allow the civilians to leave. There's been various invitations to the civilians to leave, but they have not availed themselves of those offers. I'm guessing that the civilians are largely the families of the troops in Azovstal, and perhaps they are frightened of the kind of things that they may think the Russians might do to them. So it could be that the intervention of these UN agencies will persuade them that it's safe for them to leave. I hope so. The Russians, by the way, have made it completely clear that any negotiations for the departure of these civilians are confined to the civilians alone. The troops in the Azovstal factory must instead lay down their arms and surrender to the Russian military. Well, we'll see, as I said, whether these negotiations succeed. They are somewhat different from all the other negotiations which we've heard about until now. Now, for the rest, there's continuing fighting across Donbass. Russian troops are now definitely closing in on Slavyansk. The town of Liman, which is on the way to Slavyansk, seems to be on the verge of being invested by the Russian military. I've been hearing all kinds of incredibly plaintive comments from various Ukrainian units about the desperate position in which they find themselves. There is a Ukrainian unit of about 1,000 men, for example, which is apparently trapped next to the Oskol reservoir and apparently now has no real option other than to surrender or be destroyed. And there was another incredibly plaintive report from another Ukrainian unit that has been involved in the fighting near Izium. They say that they were trapped by the Russians, that most of them, the unit itself suffered something like 60% casualties, that the command system broke down, that they haven't been paid or rearmed, that they're running short of ammunition, and that they had to basically escape entrapment without orders. So, with lots of things like this now trickling out from Donbass, and they do all indicate what, as far as I can see, is an increasingly grim picture for the Ukrainian troops there. Another reason why I think the picture for the Ukrainian troops is becoming increasingly grim is that Western news agencies and intelligence agencies and all of these people who in the past have been talking up stories about the victories of the Ukrainians in the fighting are no longer talking in that way. They're coming up with a new set of stories about huge Russian casualties, not talking about Ukrainian casualties. They're talking about how the Russians have had to merge units together, send their equipment back to Russia for repair. I don't know why this last, by the way, is a problem, but anyway, that's one of the things that I've seen said, that the Russians are running out of high precision missiles. I've seen variants of that story going all the way back to the middle of March. There was a very bizarre story at one point that the Russians were running out of engines for their rockets, because their long-range cruise missiles, because these engines were supposedly all built in Ukraine, something which hasn't been true for several years, in fact. But anyway, lots of reports of that nature today, and also claims that the Russian advances, and it's interesting that the Western agencies are all admitting that they are Russian advances, that they're running behind schedule. Of course, nobody knows quite what the Russian schedule is. So it seems that there's admissions that the Russians are indeed advancing. They seem to be closing, as I said, steadily towards Slavyansk, which is one of the major strong points of what's left of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. And these reports of Russian advances are no longer realistically being disputed by Western intelligence agencies and by Western media. Meanwhile, Jens Stoltenberg, the UN Secretary General, the NATO Secretary General, not UN Secretary General, NATO Secretary General, and various Western officials are talking about a long war in Ukraine, supposedly intended to bleed Russia dry. I have to say, I find this incredibly disturbing language. Firstly, I think any idea of a long war to bleed any side dry is misconceived and wrong. Surely the correct thing to do is to try to find means to end the war, not to perpetuate it as long as possible. After all, perpetuating the war as long as possible is only going to result in many more people dying. And it does seem to me a chilling thing when Western leaders talk about prolonging a war in that kind of way. It suggests a callousness and an indifference that I find disturbing. But anyway, putting all that to one side, who exactly is being drained away? Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine. Ukraine, by every measure, seems to be suffering by far the heavier losses. There are far more pictures out there of dead Ukrainian soldiers, some of them hideous to see, than I have found of Russian soldiers or of Russian prisoners. And we're hearing rather desperate claims from Ukrainian commanders on the Donbass battlefront about their situation becoming increasingly dire. So heavy Ukrainian losses and also massive damage to the Ukrainian economy. Now, I'm going to discuss the economics in more detail in a moment, but the chair of the Russian Central Bank yesterday spoke about a possible GDP decline in Russia of around 8 to 10%, with a full recovery back to the levels of at the start of this year, by 2024. Ukraine's central bank, by contrast, is talking about a GDP contraction this year of 1/3. Millions of people are leaving Ukraine. Much of its industrial base is being destroyed by Russian missile attacks. And of course, as we've discussed in other programs, both here on the Duran and in Alex Christophorou's updates, the Russians have now been taking steps to destroy the Ukrainian railway system, attacking substations, electric power substations, making it difficult for electric trains to move around. There are also growing reports, widespread reports across Ukraine of fuel shortages, of the country running out of oil, of petrol, of diesel. The Ukrainian government is apparently asking Ukrainians to stop trying to tank up their cars with petrol because the scarce supplies of petrol that are left are needed for the military. And the probability is, with Russian attacks on refineries continuing, that supplies of oil and oil products are going to continue to dwindle. And it seems to me that everything points to the fact that long before Russia is ever significantly drained in any conceivable way, Ukraine is heading increasingly towards not just an economic collapse, but to a systemic humanitarian crisis. Is that what Western governments, is that what the NATO Secretary General wants to achieve? There's been talk about fighting this war to the last Ukrainian. When I hear some of this talk and language, it does seem to me that people who are talking about a prolonged war ought to consider the cost that it's inflicting upon Ukraine itself. Now, I've said this many times, I'm going to say it again. Ukraine isn't going to recover Crimea. It's going to lose Donbass. Before long, it's going to lose Kherson region. Better that it negotiate and come to a settlement with Russia now than it go on losing territory, losing more of its economy, millions more of its people who are fleeing the country, and seeing the entire devastation of its society. A war of attrition between Russia and Ukraine is a war which Ukraine inevitably is going to lose. It's going to lose it, and it is indeed the kind of war that the Russians are deliberately fighting. And that brings me again to this discussion about military supplies from the West. We're hearing lots about how the West is pouring weapon systems into Ukraine. Poland has now apparently supplied 200 T-72 tanks. These are unmodernized tanks left over from the period of the Cold War. The Germans are discussing sending armored vehicles as well. The United States is sending howitzers, 100 howitzers, and Britain and France are sending artillery, and Canada are sending artillery systems as well. As has been pointed out by several people, these weapon systems, these heavy weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine, come nowhere close to replacing its current losses. Ukraine is losing more weapon systems by the day than the West seems capable of sending to replace them. And one consequence of this is that those 200 Polish tanks, T-72 tanks, that have been sent to Ukraine apparently account for half of Poland's tank fleet. Poland had 400 tanks before the war. Now it's supplied 200 of those to Ukraine, leaving the Polish military with just 200 left. Now, apparently these are modernized tanks. They're more advanced. They're in better condition than the T-72s that were supplied to Ukraine. But they are still T-72s. And of course, if one is really, if the Poles are really contemplating occupations or advances into Western Ukraine, then the weapon systems that they've been supplying to Ukraine are going to leave the Poles themselves dangerously short of armor, especially if they find themselves in any kind of confrontation with the Russians. Now, I'm not going to push this further. I've been looking at figures for Russian reserve stocks of armor, of armored vehicles. Supposedly the Russians have 20 to 30,000 tanks in reserve. Some of them may not be in the best condition. They, of course, also have armored factories, armored vehicle factories. There's the giant factory in Nizhny Tagil. Undoubtedly, they can replace armor and they can repair it. And there are indications, by the way, that they're capturing armor for Ukrainians, and that's being funneled to the Donbass militia. It seems to me that on every level, this is in military terms, this is a war of attrition, that Ukraine cannot win. And talking about a prolonged war in Ukraine is simply a disaster for Ukraine. It's going to weaken Ukraine far more than it can ever possibly weaken Russia. That's the first thing I want to say. But of course, there is another level, again, in which we are in a war of attrition. And this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It is a war between the West and Russia, because, of course, the sanctions war is ultimately an economic war of attrition. And perhaps interestingly, we've now had interesting comments about the situation of the Russians in terms of that economic war from two very senior Russian officials. The most important of them is Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chair of the Russian Central Bank, and who, as is clear from the various meetings that Putin has with his economic experts, is the person who is leading the struggle, Russia's struggle to adapt the economy to the new conditions which have been caused by the sanctions. Now, Nabiullina gave a long address, explanation of where she sees the Russian economy going on Friday. Now, bits and bobs of this address were published in the Western media, but they downplayed, or indeed in some cases outright ignored, the big decision that she made on Friday, which was to cut interest rates in Russia from 17% to 14%. Back in February, when the United States launched the West's economic war against Russia, orchestrating sanctions against Russia's central bank, seizing or freezing, as they like to say, the central bank's reserves and sanctioning the central bank itself. At that point, Nabiullina felt obliged to stabilize the ruble and the Russian banking system by increasing interest rates to 20%. A few weeks ago, she reduced interest rates to 17%, and she's now reduced interest rates again to 14%. Bear in mind that when she increased interest rates in February to 20%, interest rates in Russia before that rise had been 10%. So interest rates in Russia today, the nominal rates of interest, are closer at 14% to the 10% that they were in before the war than they are to the 20% to which they were lifted as a crisis measure. And what has happened to the ruble in response to this interest rate cut? Well, it's strengthened again. It's now trading at around 70 to 74 to the dollar in international markets. In Russia, I understand, it's actually stronger still. Now, that may not be as Nabolina herself admitted there's lots of uncertainties, there's huge volatilities, but certainly Western expectations back in February that the ruble would collapse, that it would go into free fall, that has obviously not happened. On the contrary, after a brief, though sharp dip, the ruble has stabilized and it's steadily strengthened. And in my opinion, the primary reason it's strengthened, and it's touched upon by Nabolina herself, is because of the stability of the financial system within Russia itself. And this is reflected by the fact that Russians themselves are using the ruble. They are, after all, overwhelmingly the greater number of people who hold and own rubles. And the fact that they are sticking by the ruble is what is causing the ruble to remain strong and to strengthen further still. Western assumptions that it's somehow connected to Russia's sales of oil and gas may be wrong, because it seems to me that what's actually happening is that most of the money that Russia is earning from oil and gas sales in the form of dollars and euros is simply piling up in dollar and euro accounts in Russia itself, because the central bank and the Russian government do not want all of this money to be converted into rubles in case the ruble strengthens too much. There's talk that it may fall to 60 rubles to the dollar or even 50. So it's not a situation at all like the one that Western governments had anticipated. But Nabolina had more things to say. She talked about the inflation situation. Now, the part of what Nabolina said about inflation in Russia that, of course, all the Western media have latched onto is that she spoke about a potential inflation readout for the entire year for 2022 of around 18 to 22%. That's what she said that, inflation might look like over the whole of the year. But what they didn't do is drill more deeply into her more detailed comments, because she made the point that this inflation number of 18 to 22% was largely the product of the dramatic surge in prices for some consumer goods, which took place in Russia in late February and in March in response to the massive pullout by Western companies from Russia and the interruption of Western exports to Russia. She said that underlying inflation, the true rate of monthly inflation in Russia, is around 10 to 12%. Now, that is roughly the same as the true inflation rate in the West. So, moreover, Nabolina expects or hopes, because she accepts that there are huge uncertainties, that this inflation rate will fall. And she thinks inflation in Russia will fall to around 6%, perhaps higher, perhaps lower, in 2023, and come down to around 4% by 2024. She also had much to say about the performance of the real economy. And this obviously was her major point of concern, because she said that though demand in Russia remains strong, because of the interruptions in imports, because of the problems in Russian supply chains that this is causing, supply cannot yet balance demand, which is the reason, by the way, for the inflation rate at being at around 10 to 12%. And she spoke going forward about a GDP contraction this year of around 8 to 10% based on that fact. In other words, caused almost entirely by that cut-off in imports. But she also said that the priority has to be to try and find ways to assist Russian industry to adapt. And I've discussed this many times, and I've said that, in my opinion, the consumer economy, where most of these problems are, is precisely that part of the economy which is most adaptable, and we will start to see adaptations take place reasonably rapidly. And Navalina went on to say that she expects that by the end of 2023, Russian output will have recovered about half the output lost in 2022, with a full recovery of output by 2024, provided obviously all of these adaptations in the economy take place over that period. Now, this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be complicated. And again, Navalina spoke about this. But I have to say, I think more likely than not, she's right. I think more likely than not, the Russians will be able to make all of these adaptations to the real economy. Most recessions, the really difficult and dangerous recessions, start in the financial system. And with the financial system in Russia stable, with Russians still choosing to use the ruble and to hold rubles, it becomes attractive for Russian manufacturers, entrepreneurs, business people to start investing in those kind of products that Russia needs in order to restore lost output. In fact, many of them are going to do very well out of this. And, this is, she gave examples, she's given examples in an address she gave to the Duma of some of the goods that need to be substituted. So, for example, she said in the garment trade, Russia makes most of its clothes. But even the clothes that it does make, there are going to be problems because buttons have generally been imported from the European Union. But Russia can certainly make buttons, and there are people in Russia who will probably be looking to step into that role and to make buttons to provide to Russian garment manufacturers. She gave another example. She said that paper, Russia is able to make most of its paper, but there are certain processes that are needed to make that paper white. And again, most of that was imported from the European Union. But again, this is not high-tech stuff. The Russians can certainly do it. It's relatively easy industrial technology, manufacturing technology. There will be Russian businesses and companies that can do that and can do that in Russia itself. And if not in Russia, well, Russia has trading partners, countries like China, India, Turkey, Vietnam, where there are plenty of people who make things like buttons, which the Russians can easily import, even if they decide that for reasons of economic security, they can they need to develop these industries for themselves. So we see that these are problems which, however difficult and challenging they may be to deal with in the short term, can probably be dealt with in the medium to long term. And when Navalina talks about a recovery by 2024, provided stability is maintained in the financial system, then things should be, I suspect, much as he expects. And by 2024, we will see some sort of recovery. Moreover, the Russians seem to be taking further steps to discuss how to strengthen their financial system even further. And that brings me to the second Russian official who's discussed things at length in terms of economic policy. And this is Nikolai Patrushev, the very powerful secretary of the Russia's Security Council, a rather forbidding personality, somebody who is in overall charge of Russia's intelligence agencies, and by the way, a notable hardliner. Anyway, Patrushev, who is somebody who I suspect has always wanted to see Russia move to a position of self-sufficiency, disclosed that there is a committee of experts which has been brought together in Russia with a view to finding means to strengthen the ruble and to, in effect, separate the ruble from the Western financial system whilst keeping it convertible. And he said that this council of experts is looking at linking the ruble to the value of a basket of commodities as well as gold. Now, that's not quite a gold-backed ruble, which some people have been talking about, because clearly it's going to be a more diversified basket of commodities than just gold. So it'll look at wheat, grain, coal, oil, metals, or who knows what. But it will mean that Russians who buy rubles or choose to hold rubles will know that the ruble is backed by a basket of commodities, that in other words, it's not just a fiat currency that can be printed without limit, as the dollar is, but is actually one which is secured to real items within the real economy. And some Russians have pointed out that if this actually happens, it will make the ruble one of the hardest currencies in the world. Now, there's also been comments that this would be a problem. It would mean for some parts of the Russian economy, it would, for example, it might, for example, hit exporters who relied on a very soft ruble, to make their economy competitive, to make their products competitive in international markets. But with Russia gearing away from integration into the world economy and now looking increasingly at self-sufficiency, well, it makes sense. Now, would a ruble, internationally convertible, though not in the West because of the sanctions, but would a ruble backed by commodities, a hard ruble, be a challenge to dollar hegemony? I rather think not, at least in the short to medium term. Given the scale of Russian economic operations, trading operations around the globe, I still find it difficult to imagine even such a hard ruble as a serious alternative to the dollar. But you never know, and it might be an indicator of things to come. Meanwhile, more reports are coming through of the Russians working away to develop trading links with other countries. They're now selling more coal to China in return for RMB, Chinese currency. There's apparently now detailed and prolonged negotiations with India for currency swaps and for agreements on the sale of various products. Apparently the idea is not to sell oil for rupees, but to agree that other products will be sold in currencies, in rubles and rupees, but that the oil sales will continue to be made for the time being in dollars and euros. That seems to be what the Russians have proposed to the Indians. There's talk that a draft agreement has been presented by the Indians in those terms, but that seems to be the general idea at the moment. I suspect that's a transitional arrangement until eventually India also moves towards rupee-ruble trade for oil and other energy products. India, by the way, is facing energy shortages, as is China, as is Indonesia, and all of these look to be trying to solve these by importing more Russian oil. We're at more Russian oil and more Russian energy products. So the Russians are not finding it difficult at the moment to find alternative buyers. There's been suggestions that the West will try to withdraw insurance cover for Russian tankers. The Russians are already working hard to sort out their own insurance systems for those tankers. Again, it always astonishes me that Westerners imagine that they can find solutions to these things by themselves and that nobody else can duplicate Western systems. I remember on that point how just a few years ago, back in 2014, there was universal skepticism that the Russians would ever be able to get an alternative to SWIFT up and running. And it was widely said that alternatives to SWIFT in Russia wouldn't work. The Russian banks wouldn't really want to use these alternatives to SWIFT, and that it would all be stillborn. Well, an alternative to SWIFT was created in Russia. It is operating in Russia. It is operating successfully in Russia. And the Russians are working now to expand it, just as they're expanding their Mir payment cards, their other payment systems, and they've been able to do this successfully. So the nuclear option, as it was called, of disconnecting Russian banks from SWIFT, remember how it was just called a nuclear option back in January and February? Well, that's failed. That has not proved to be the case after all. And I suspect that's what's going to continue. We're going to continue to see that over the next few years. In fact, more and more countries which want to buy Russian energy products, other Russian products, are presumably going to have to connect themselves to Russian payment systems, which I suspect are going over time to be extended. So it's extended internationally. So it's looking to me increasingly as if the Russians are going to have hard times ahead. They're going to have difficulties adjusting. It's not going to be easy for them at all. There's possibilities that all sorts of things could go wrong, and one must never assume that everything is going to turn out as planned. But they do have ideas of how they can come through the sanctions war, the war of economic attrition that they are facing. And if all their plans come to fruition, or if only some of them do, it's quite plausible that in 2, 3, 5 years' time, we're going to see a Russian economy that's more solid, harder, if you like, than the Russian economy that went in. Anyway, that's how it's looking at the moment. Let's look at the situation in the West. Well, first of all, it's now becoming, I think, clear that inflation is still rising across the Eurozone. The Financial Times, as I discussed yesterday, talked about stagflation stalking the Eurozone. The United States has witnessed its first contraction. It's since the end of the pandemic crisis. This is unexpected, except I should say by myself. There's hopes that this is only temporary because of strong demand, but strong demand at a time when there are increasing supply issues, it seems to me, can only complicate and increase inflation problems. Meanwhile, there are growing signs of unease and stress in the financial system, and also in parts of the retail economy. We've seen a major tumble, for example, in shares at Amazon, and there are problems apparently within the Amazon group in its totality. Now, this, it seems to me, could be an indication, given the importance of Amazon in the Western retail economies, that retail growth is actually slowing. I know that's not what people are saying, but it seems to me that given the nature of what Amazon is, that's the most logical explanation for its problems. The Nasdaq has just had its worst month since the 2008 crisis. And it always seems to me that big tech companies, which seem to have come out of the pandemic crisis looking very strong, are also now starting to experience problems, and they may also be a precursor of greater problems coming. The Federal Reserve Board in the United States is now in a very difficult situation because, on the one hand, it's aware of surging inflation and it's got to consider what it does. And it's been giving every conceivable indication that it's intending to raise interest rates, and it raise them hard, even though it acknowledges and everybody accepts that doing that will result in a serious recession in the United States. But, of course, does the Federal Reserve Board really want to risk a recession, given the extent of economic indebtedness, financial indebtedness, not just in the United States, but across the entire Western economic system? A recession and high interest rates would be very critical news for a great many people. So what does the Federal Reserve Board actually do? Well, we're all waiting to see. It seems to me some interest rate rises are now inevitable because there would be a shocking loss of credibility if they didn't happen. But the Federal Reserve Board, I suspect, is going to be extremely concerned about the risk of a hard landing. And it may, going forward, mean that it is unwilling to raise interest rates to the extent that it needs to in order to bring inflation in the United States and elsewhere out of control. That's a problem in the United States. It's an even worse problem in Europe and in Japan. In Japan, we see a collapse in the value of the Japanese currency, the yen. And we're seeing falls in the value of the euro and of the pound sterling, all, of course, against the dollar. The ruble is strengthening against the dollar, but all other currencies, it seems, all of the major currencies, all of the other major currencies, sterling, the euro, and the yen, are weakening against the dollar. And that, of course, reflects the fact that the United States, the Federal Reserve Board, still has some room for maneuver because the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. And that gives the Federal Reserve Board some degree of ability to raise interest rates. But in Europe, Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank are still keeping nominal interest rates in negative territory. So even as inflation across the Eurozone is now rising, it continued to rise in April after the shock figures in March. Nominal interest rates in Europe continue to be at minus 0.5. And the European Central Bank continues quantitative easing. It is doing so because it is buying essentially the bonds of the southern European economies, Italy, Greece, Spain, increasingly of France, because that is how it is keeping those economies afloat. And the risk, of course, is that the weakening euro is going to increase inflationary pressures within Europe. And, of course, it's also going to allow for surging demand. And the risk is that inflation in Europe is going to continue rising. Now, why is inflation rising? Well, partly, as I've discussed in many programs, as Alex and I discussed in programs that we were making a year ago, the immediate source of the inflation in the United States was the reckless, irresponsible fiscal policies of the Biden administration after it took office. It took what was already a rapidly recovering economy, the US economy, coming out of the pandemic crisis, and it tried to turbocharge it by engaging in a massive fiscal spend. And at a time when the economy was already running hot, that was inevitably going to cause higher inflation. And of course, so it did. Well, what the United States, what the Europeans, what the Western powers have all done is that they've made that inflation problem that they created for themselves last year, they've made it even worse by engaging the Russians in an economic war of attrition. And that has resulted in higher energy prices, higher food prices, all of which are contributing to major pressures on Western consumers. Now, Russia is largely self-sufficient in food, almost entirely self-sufficient in food, and is, of course, self-sufficient in energy. So while one can't say that the prices of energy and food in Russia are completely stable, the fact that there is more than enough in Russia of food and energy to go around acts as an anchor which depresses inflationary pressures. In the West, it's otherwise. The United States is to some extent energy self-sufficient, though this isn't quite as strong an energy self-sufficiency as some people believe. Europe, of course, is not. No part of the West is food self-sufficient any longer. So rises in food prices, rises in fertilizer prices, rises in energy costs are contributing to inflationary pressures. But what are the Western powers doing in response to all of this? Well, it seems to me that the Federal Reserve Board is trying to work its way up to trying to increase interest rates. But in Europe, on the contrary, all the focus instead is on more ways to wage the economic war on the Russians. So we now have a proposal, even as energy costs in Europe are rising, even as apparently there's a shortage of diesel fuel in some parts of Europe, even as there are reports, which I can't, by the way, fully confirm, that half of France's nuclear reactors are no longer operating because of supply shortages and repair problems. Even as all that is happening, the Europeans are now cranking up to deny themselves Russian oil. Now, this isn't going to have a big effect, or this is not going to have the massive effect on Russia that they think. It's absolutely true that the Russians sold half their oil exports to Europe. But of course, that means by definition that they sold half their oil exports to other countries. And of course, more of those other countries will want to buy Russian oil because it will come at a discount as oil prices surge. And of course, even if there is a discount, oil prices, the price for the oil which the Russians are selling will still be higher than it was before the present tight commodities crisis appeared a year or so ago. So we're going to see that the Russians will somehow be able to keep things ticking over, because also, as Nabolina, the Russian central bank chair, pointed out, there's been a massive fall in Russian imports. So anyway, they need less hard currency than they once did because they're not importing as much as they used to, even though that fall in imports caused by the sanctions has caused the Russians a whole set of other problems. But of course, the Europeans are going to be hit by these energy rises in energy prices very hard. And of course, they're going to be hit further by the decline of the euro because they have to buy oil from third parties if they're not buying it from Russia. Now, they paid for their oil, a lot of their oil from Russia in euros, but if they're going to buy oil in the Gulf, if they're going to buy it in Nigeria, if they're going to buy it in Angola, as they've been saying, well, they're going to have to pay it in dollars. Pay for it in dollars. And of course, the euro is losing value against the dollar. So oil from the Gulf, from Nigeria, from Angola is going to become more expensive. But nonetheless, that seems to be what the Europeans are going to do to themselves. They were warned against doing it by no less a person than Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary. She told them, don't cut yourself off from Russian oil. Find other means. All you're going to do is you're going to cause energy prices to surge, both in Europe and, of course, by the way, in the United States. And the Russians, paradoxically, because of the higher prices, will be able to offset their losses from oil sales to Europe through the higher prices that they are going to charge other people. So don't do it. But, of course, the Europeans are going to do it because having got themselves on this sanctions escalator, having worked themselves up into this position of waging this economic war of attrition, they see no way of getting off. And of course, they also have these very strange councils. So we see Robert Habeck, the German economics minister, a person who before he became economics minister had a long background in green politics and who before that was a doctor of philosophy and a writer of children's books. Anyway, he now claims that Germany has halved, more than halved, its dependence on Russian oil. So it can now apparently or supposedly withstand a cut-off from Russian oil. Well, he might have been able to reduce the need for Russian oil in the short term by importing oil from other places. But if he cuts himself off, if he cuts himself entirely off from the option of Germany buying oil from Russia, well, what he's going to find is that that's going to become more expensive to sustain. It doesn't seem that he wants to understand that or is able to understand that. So he's coming up with this idea that because Germany used to import 30% of its oil from Russia, but now only at the moment imports 12%, well, you can do away with that extra 12% and it isn't going to be a problem. That this is a dip, that this is an artificial dip in imports of oil from Russia done by who knows how, isn't, as I said, something that he seems to understand or appreciate. And he doesn't seem to understand either the costs of sustaining it in the long term. So, despite warnings from all sorts of people, even the usual hesitant, stammering, bumbling warnings from Olaf Scholz, warnings from other people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, warnings, of course, from Janet Yellen, that's what the Europeans are going to do. And, of course, it's only a question of time before they do the big thing, which all their industrial sectors are trying to persuade them not to do, which is to cut themselves off from Russian gas as well. It's all very sad and very strange to see how they're doing all these things to themselves, but that is what they're doing as they look constantly for ways to achieve that outcome which they failed to achieve in February. They thought if they froze the Russian central bank's reserves, if they sanctioned the Russian central bank, that they would somehow manage to cause the entire Russian economy to collapse like a house of cards. With that not happening, they're running around desperately looking for ways to achieve that, even though the price they're paying for all of these further steps that they're taking is a price that European consumers are having to pay. One wonders for how much longer this can go on and how much more damage and pain European consumers are prepared to take. Anyway, that's where we are. Now, on gas for rubles, what I'm hearing is that more and more European companies are quietly and surreptitiously going along with this, even though they're not prepared to say so openly, because they don't want to annoy the European Commission and provoke direct criticism to themselves. But what that is doing is it's undermining another part of Robert Habeck's strategy, because some European countries, with the encouragement of the Commission, EU Commission, and to some extent Robert Habeck himself, are refusing to go along with the gas for rubles project. So countries like Poland, Finland, Denmark, Bulgaria are denying themselves Russian gas. What, of course, they're doing is that they're asking those countries that are quietly going along with the gas for rubles idea to supply them with gas in place of the gas that they are not themselves buying directly from Russia. So that's causing gas to be recycled and recirculated within the European gas system. But the Russians are making it clear that they're not prepared to increase volumes to enable that to happen. So what in effect is happening is that the Germans, instead of replenishing their gas reserves for the winter, are finding themselves forced to divert gas, which they would otherwise have used, to place in those reserves. Well, they're forced to supply it to Poland, to Finland, to the Baltic states, to Bulgaria, to Denmark, to all the others. Again, where that's going to leave them in the autumn or winter, I don't know. Perhaps something will be found. Perhaps there'll be some device to get more gas from Azerbaijan or from Algeria or from Qatar. Difficult to see how that's going to be done, but human ingenuity is remarkable. Perhaps they will succeed in getting people to wear more woolly pullovers, change the setting of their thermostats, do all that sort of thing. Whether European industrial users are going to be in a position to do the same thing is, of course, an entirely different matter. But again, we see how foolish decisions are now compounding themselves and are making things within the European economies harder. Now, I'm going to finish on a slightly positive note. The British, until very recently, were the most outspoken in calling for more and more sanctions against Russia. I've noticed that over the last few days and weeks, the British have essentially stopped saying that. You still find demands in part of the British media for the EU to cut itself off entirely from Russian energy supplies, but the British government seems to have softened its language on this. I suspect that the Conservative government is becoming increasingly concerned at the gathering cost of living crisis in Britain, and that there is growing uncertainty about the wisdom of this policy. And I'm going to guess that there are some ministers. I have some guesses as to who they are, but I'm not going to name them because I don't want to embarrass anybody. I suspect that some ministers are privately advising the cabinet about the risks of more sanctions, of the perpetuation of the war of economic attrition. So I'm guessing that there are words of advice being given to slow down. But whether that's going to be enough over the next few weeks, months, we shall see. In the meantime, the fact that the British do seem to be slowing down may be a relatively positive sign. It may be a sign that sooner or later sanity will prevail, and what we're going to see is an attempt to end both the fighting in Ukraine and the economic war of attrition to try and find a negotiated solution to this crisis. Well, that's enough for me today. That's an a whole hour of rather heavy reporting and analysis. I think that's as much as I can realistically ask you to listen to. Thank you for joining me again. I look forward to you joining me again. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Rumble, Locals, where you can join our community. Remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to go to our shop. And last but not least, tick that like button if you've liked this video and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.